On the 21st of June, 2001, a freight train pulled away from the Yandi iron ore mine in the Pilbara region of Western Australia and straight into history. The thing ran 7.3 kilometers, roughly 4.5 miles, made up of loaded iron ore cars, 682 of them strung together in one consist, dragged along by 8 General Electric AC6000CW diesel locomotives. A single driver had command of all 99,734 tons of it. But the reason the feat is worth a closer look is this: the United States, home to the biggest freight rail system on the planet, cannot dependably run trains even half that long without choking off intersections, holding up passenger service, and courting derailments. So where does the gap come from? The Pilbara is a slab of red desert tucked into the northwest corner of Western Australia, about as big as California. Hardly anyone calls it home. Beneath that ancient rust-colored ground sits one of the richest concentrations of iron ore on Earth. Fully 98% of the nation's iron ore reserves sit in Western Australia, and almost every bit of that traces back to the Pilbara. In the 2020 to 2021 financial year on its own, miners out there moved hundreds of millions of tons of ore down to Indian Ocean ports, most of it destined for China's steel mills. So how does a region with barely a soul in it wind up hosting one of the most punishing freight rail networks in existence? Shifting that kind of tonnage demands a rail system like no other on the globe. 5 distinct private railways lace across the Pilbara, each one owned and run by a different mining outfit. BHP runs the Mount Newman and Goldsworthy pair. Rio Tinto handles the Hamersley and Robe River network, a web of more than 1,700 kilometers of track feeding 15 separate mines. Fortescue Metals Group laid its own line from 2008 onward, after Australian courts turned down its request to ride on BHP's rails, and Roy Hill, financed by Hancock Prospecting, wrapped up its 395-kilometer railway back in 2015. Taken together, those 5 systems add up to north of 3,800 kilometers of heavy haul track, every kilometer of it constructed and looked after by the miners themselves. The trains they put on it carry iron ore to Port Hedland, the largest bulk export harbor on Earth, a facility that pushed past 500 million metric tons in 2018 alone. And each of those trains performs precisely one function. They drag iron ore from inland pits out to the coast. No passenger trains share these lines. No mixed freight. No commuter runs riding the same steel. No towns dotted with grade crossings every couple hundred meters. Nothing but loaded ore cars, locomotives, and several hundred kilometers of purpose-built track threading through bare desert. But here's the piece almost everyone overlooks when they stare at the headline figures. What makes a 4-mile train workable isn't the locomotives or the wagons. It's everything that's been left out. Build a railroad to perform a single task, and you get to tailor every part of it to that one job. The rail is beefier, usually 68 kilograms per meter, set on concrete sleepers engineered for the heaviest axle loads found anywhere. The curves stay gentle because surveyors ran the lines across open country with no cities forcing detours. The signaling is tuned for one kind of traffic moving in steady, foreseeable rhythms. Even the passing loops, the spots where opposing trains pull aside for one another, were laid out long enough to swallow consists that run for kilometers. A typical BHP iron ore train fields 3 locomotives pulling 224 loaded wagons, somewhere near 26,000 tons of ore on a single trip. As many as 9 of these grind down the Mount Newman line in a given day. Every wagon is basically a clone of the next, packed with the identical commodity to the identical weight, which keeps the forces inside the train predictable. The engineers never have to account for a feather-light empty hopper sitting 3 cars back from a loaded liquid tanker, the kind of mismatch that breeds slack action able to tear a coupler knuckle apart or jackknife a consist mid-curve. Each car carries the same load. Each car behaves the same way. And it's that sameness that lets the train run to such extreme lengths without danger. Still, the engineering by itself doesn't account for why these railroads ended up shaped the way they are. Underneath it runs an economic logic that matters every bit as much. Mike Darby, who served as BHP's vice president of rail when the 2001 record run took place, told Railway Gazette the whole exercise was about driving the technology as far as it would go. He put it bluntly, "Unless you keep testing different things, you'll never find out what's possible." That record-breaking train made it 275 kilometers along its 426-kilometer path from Yandi toward Port Hedland before BHP called it off, content with the data in hand. This was no publicity trick. It was a stress test of a system purpose-built from day one to carry exactly this sort of load. Each additional wagon on a train translates into fewer trips across the year, fewer hours on the locomotives, fewer crew swaps, and a slimmer cost for every ton landed at port. When your whole business hinges on shifting hundreds of millions of tons for the lowest unit cost imaginable, the pull toward longer trains isn't merely powerful. It's a matter of survival. Rio Tinto carried that same thinking further still. In 2018, the company pulled off the planet's first fully autonomous heavy haul train run across its Pilbara network. Come 2020, the entire auto haul system was up and running. Today, 220 Rio Tinto iron ore trains move with nobody at the controls, watched from an operations hub in Perth, over 1,500 kilometers removed from the nearest locomotive. The firm bills it as the largest robot on the planet. A handful of drivers stay on call for manual fallback and to manage the last stretch into the port zones, but the main line running is entirely driverless. Sit with that. 220 trains, millions of tons of iron ore, crossing the desert with no human hand on the throttle. Yet driverless operation works in the Pilbara for the very same reason everything else does, because of what's missing. No school buses idling at crossings, no Amtrak service needing to slip past in the other direction, no classification yards where dozens of car types have to be sorted into mixed trains. These are sealed-off systems, and that very isolation is at once their biggest advantage and the reason they simply don't map onto what unfolds in America. None of this means the Pilbara railroads are free of danger. In November of 2018, a BHP driver climbed down from a loaded train of 4 locomotives and 268 wagons to look at a faulty car. With him out of the cab, the train began to roll on its own. It ran 92 kilometers, averaging 110 kilometers per hour, until BHP's remote control center in Perth deliberately threw it off the rails by flipping a set of points. The crash tore up 1.5 kilometers of track and wrecked hundreds of ore wagons. Nobody was injured, and nobody could have been, because the runaway was barreling through empty desert on a private line with not one grade crossing in its way. That final fact is the whole point. Now, the American freight network is colossal. Somewhere around 140,000 miles of track move roughly a third of the country's intercity freight tonnage. 7 Class 1 railroads rake in better than 90% of all industry revenue. The big names, Union Pacific, BNSF, Norfolk Southern, CSX, are the giants of American railroading. But the system they run wasn't laid out from a blank sheet for a single purpose. It grew over close to 2 centuries, with rails threaded through cities and small towns, across farm fields and mountain passes, crossing roads at nearly every turn. The Federal Railroad Administration tallies somewhere around 212,000 highway rail grade crossings across the network. Across the Midwest and West, where towns got platted on a grid, a few stretches carry a crossing every couple hundred feet. Each marks the spot where a freight train and a passing car, truck, or ambulance might arrive at the same level at the same instant. Texas by itself has north of 15,000 grade crossings. Illinois tops 12,000. Set that beside the Pilbara, where a train can run 400 kilometers without meeting one public road. Grade crossings, though, are far from the only headache. Sharing that very infrastructure is Amtrak, the national passenger operator, running over rails that the freight companies own. Federal law obliges those freight railroads to hand Amtrak dispatching priority. In reality, the freight carriers brush that rule aside routinely, since making them comply is a tall order. During 2023, Amtrak logged more than 900,000 minutes of delay inflicted on its riders by freight interference. Stack those minutes up, and you get over a year and a half of waiting compressed into one calendar year. Stretching freight trains out only deepens every one of these troubles. A 2-mile train seals off a grade crossing for minutes on end. It won't tuck into sidings that were built generations ago for shorter consists, so it ends up holding back every other train on that segment, freight and passenger alike. And beyond all that, wrangling a mixed cargo train of varying weights and handling traits at such a length is far trickier than running a uniform iron ore train across flat desert. If this comparison is proving useful, hit subscribe. Every week we dig into locomotive history, heavy haul engineering, and how railroads actually operate. That said, here's the turn where the whole question starts to feel less like engineering and more like business. The march toward longer trains picked up speed under a doctrine known as precision scheduled railroading, PSR for short, which spread across the industry beginning in the late 1990s. Hunter Harrison, the man who first put precision scheduled railroading into practice at Illinois Central, built the approach on one plain idea: run fewer trains, stretch them longer, lock them to rigid timetables, and slash any expense that doesn't move freight directly. Once Harrison carried the model to Canadian National and afterward to CSX, the remaining Class I railroads fell in line. By 2022, 6 of the 7 biggest freight railroads had taken up some flavor of it. For shareholders, PSR has paid off handsomely. From 2011 to 2021, the 7 largest freight railroads trimmed their combined headcount by something like 28%. Certain subdivisions shed half their workers. Union Pacific on its own cut more than 10,000 jobs in well under 10 years. Operating ratios fell, share prices rose, dividends grew. Wall Street applauded every railroad that could shove more freight with fewer hands and less hardware. The median freight train in America now runs about 5,400 feet, roughly a mile. But that median paper overs an enormous spread. The Association of American Railroads says 99% of trains come in under 14,000 feet, around 2.6 miles. A 2025 review of the Southwest Corridor at Union Pacific found that, in that region, 10% of its trains ran beyond 2.5 miles. These aren't freak exceptions on a handful of routes. On certain corridors, they're everyday business. Corridors whose sidings, signals, and staffing were everyone sized for shorter trains. And here's what makes the Australian comparison so telling. In the Pilbara, the longer trains became possible thanks to investment in the infrastructure. Thicker rail, longer passing loops, driverless signaling, every piece of it in place before the trains grew. In the United States, the trains grew first, and the infrastructure is still scrambling to keep up. A proposed cap in California would hold freight trains to roughly 125 standard cars. The train that came apart in East Palestine had 149. So this is where the fallout begins to stack up. Railroad workers and their unions contend that PSR, precision scheduled railroading, has manufactured a situation in which overlong trains run on infrastructure never meant for them, handled by thinning crews pushed to hit punishing schedules. The Federal Railroad Administration has flagged 3 derailments involving trains beyond 12,250 feet in which the sheer length played a part. States such as California, Pennsylvania, and Ohio have floated bills to cap train length, commonly at 7,500 feet. But not one of those wrecks seized the public's attention the way East Palestine would. On the night of February 3, 2023, a Norfolk Southern freight, Train 32N was running east across Ohio. It stretched 149 cars, 9,000 feet, close to 1.7 miles. 20 of those cars were loaded with hazardous materials, vinyl chloride among them. The 23rd car was riding on a wheel bearing that had run hot for miles. A wayside sensor in Salem, Ohio, roughly 17 miles short of East Palestine, picked up the elevated temperature and fired off an alert. The Norfolk Southern analyst who looked at the reading marked it as non-critical. Moments after that, the bearing let go. 38 cars piled off the rails in the heart of a small town. 3 tank cars split open as they hit. Fires erupted, and upward of 2,000 people were cleared out of a 1-mile circle around the wreckage. Then things got worse. Norfolk Southern pushed for a controlled burn of the vinyl chloride tankers, which loosed an enormous cloud of poisonous smoke over the community. The National Transportation Safety Board would later conclude the burn had never been needed, and that Norfolk Southern had fed incomplete and misleading details to the local incident commander who signed off on it. The company eventually settled with the EPA for $310 million. East Palestine wasn't the product of a freakishly long train. At 1.7 miles, it actually came in shorter than plenty of today's freight consists. But the calamity threw a spotlight on every worry that workers, regulators, and townsfolk had been voicing for years. Bearings cooking between sensors spaced too far apart. Hazardous cargo blended into ordinary freight rumbling past people's houses. Staffing cuts that left too few inspectors to spot failing gear before it fails for good. The irony cuts deep. Australia runs trains more than double the length of the East Palestine consist, as a matter of routine, through open desert with nobody aboard, and the Pilbara railroads boast a safety record that's strikingly solid. But Australian ore trains never roll through anybody's hometown. Those locomotives never share steel with passenger service. The wagons trailing them never carry vinyl chloride beside grain hoppers beside intermodal boxes. One commodity, one track, one terrain, one endpoint. Could America put together a Pilbara-style railroad along one dedicated corridor, free of grade crossings and shared traffic? The physics would hold up fine. Distributed power, driverless operation, advanced train control. Every bit of that technology is proven and on the shelf. Wyoming's coal lines in the Powder River Basin already pull off something vaguely like it, running long unit trains of a single commodity over dedicated routes. But even those share track with other freight and pass through towns with grade crossings. Putting together a genuine Pilbara-scale system across the existing American landscape would demand buying up right-of-way, wiping out hundreds of crossings per corridor, peeling freight apart from passenger traffic, and bargaining with every city council and county commission down the road. That isn't an engineering puzzle. It's a political and financial mountain that no Class 1 railroad has any reason to climb, because their shareholders keep score in quarterly operating ratios, not in infrastructure payoffs measured in decades. The Pilbara railroads never cracked those problems. They simply never had to confront them. Empty desert, iron ore underground, port works on the coast, and nothing in the middle but red dirt and open sky. The lone question was how much steel and diesel were needed to join mine to ship. For the railroads of America, the question has never been anywhere close to that clean. The network moves everything, for everybody, through everywhere. And the trains just keep growing on corridors that were never drawn up for them, run by companies that have decided stretching the system costs less than rebuilding it. If this comparison changed how you picture railroad engineering, then you'll want to see the way the longest trains in the world are really put together and controlled, car by car, from the mine face to the port. That one is coming up next.